Here on chess.com, and I am International Master Daniel Wrench. Today, due to popular request, we are going to be kicking off a new series covering some of the basics you need to know about pawn play. Obviously, we've had a few different video series talking about pawn structures on, I guess, more of an advanced level, more of a building and opening repertoire standpoint, formations, patterns, those sort of things. And we hope that many of you are enjoying that series, and obviously we've said that Pawn Structure 101 will continue from now until Kingdom Come. But what I'd like to do is back up a little bit and talk to you about some more basic pawn knowledge that you need to have. And so this entire series is going to be talked about in regards to the basic positions with pawns, and we're going to be moving backwards to forwards. What I mean by that is we are going to be starting from the most basic positions that you have to know, and then hopefully back our way up to covering more and more advanced positions. And if you're doing the work I'm asking you to do, at least trying to make an effort to figure out the ideas on your own before you let Danny spoon feed you the information, if you're making a little bit of an effort there, hopefully these patterns that we're going to be discussing will stick with you, so that the eventual goal is, I always tell my students, not so that you can brag and be the king and pawn endgame master, but so that as you start to calculate in more complex positions, not just king and pawn endings, but making a transition from a rook and pawn ending or a knight and bishop and pawn ending, all kinds of things, you're able to make a much higher level decision because of your knowledge of king and pawn endings. So it's a pretty basic philosophy, and I think everyone buys into it, and I think it's the right way to go. So this position here, we're not going to spend too much time on it. Take a quick look, people. This is known as king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th. This position wins with every single pawn, excluding the rook pawn, regardless of where the enemy king is. So we'll say that again. This position is winning regardless of where the enemy king is. Let me show you. In examples where the position is black to move, it is at our easiest. Let's say we had a position where white has opposition. In situations where it is black to move, or I guess the more accurate way to do it would be to push the pawn forward. We'll talk about why in a second. And the black king has to make a decision. This is opposition in its most basic form. The kings are directly opposing each other with one square in between them. The king cannot sit and say pass. As you know, chess, there is zugzwang. You have to make a move. And regardless of where the king goes, he is giving up a square. White simply executes, taking that square. The pawn will march forward, and there is nothing black can do about it. Okay? So once again, if the king was to move the other direction, we would take the square he's given up, the pawn goes marching on, and the game is over. What if we're in the same situation, but it is white to move? In this situation, it is an example where you can break the rule that we are going to apply in this video. The general rule of winning a basic king and pawn ending is that the pawn must remain behind the king at all times. Your king leads the way. Okay? If you break that rule, the majority of the time, the best play from your opponent will lead to a forced draw. Now, a lot of amateur players don't like hearing that. Oh, well, it's forced, but what if my opponent makes a mistake? Well, if my dog was a cat, it'd be a cat. I don't know what to say. I don't have a dog or a cat, but that's just ifs are for kids, right? And the point is, you want to rely on the best moves when you approach your studies. In a real game, we're never saying you give up, but in your studies, you should always be relying upon the best move being played by both you and your opponent. And because eventually, that's the right concept. It's a good feeling to know that the best move is coming from your opponent, and it doesn't make a difference. Very important psychology in chess. So if it's white to move, it is the one example where you can sidestep either direction, actually. You can sidestep to either direction, and he tries to stay in front, and it's the one exception where the pawn can push, and the timing will always work out for what we call the squeeze. He is squeezed out of the square because he only has one move. You take the square he's given up, and then the next move is obvious. So again, if you slide step and push, it is the one example where he is unable to hold the opposition. So in reinforcement, king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th always wins the game. I don't care if the king is here or in Chinatown. It doesn't make a difference, regardless of whose move it is. The only exception, as we pointed out, are situations with a rook pawn. Now, you will notice as you study endgames, as you get better and better, that the rook pawns tend to have their own sets of rules. I'm not saying that every rook pawn ending is a draw when you start adding more pieces on the board, but they tend to have their own sets of patterns and rules because of the dynamics of the chessboard ending. There is no I file. So that's the obvious reason why this is a draw. You can already see. Even if it's our opponent's move, once again, let's say we made this move forward and he's in opposition and he moves. Well, we wish we could go off the board, couldn't we? But we can't. You see, there's not even a place for me to draw an arrow to because there's no I file. So there is no way to force him out of the queening square, and the game will always end in a stalemate. I am not going to back up too much and review these ideas because they are basic, and you can pause the video and repeat the process. I actually recommend you do, just like washing your hair with shampoo. It's called rinse and repeat, people, okay? And if you review those ideas, the number one goal coming out of this is that you're not just taking Danny's word for it. You know in your gut, and it's very important that I mean that, in your gut, because as you solve more complicated things, and you think you knew it, you think you really believed it, but you're calculating a complicated line, and if you don't really understand these king and pawn ending basics, it will affect your decision-making progress and the process in a more complex position. So, king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, Ouchtown, population, the enemy. Okay? The game is over. Now, we back up. How exactly do we achieve such a position? By force. Well, that's our next step. Knowing king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th wins, having that goal, we start to learn the basic way to use opposition as our tool to reach our goal. Opposition is the process of moving the king to an odd number of squares in front of the enemy king, in which case they have to make a decision. They cannot sit. That decision can be moving backwards to a square or sidestepping to a square. But in any case, we will be given progress on one of these squares. Example, if the king moves back, we obviously can come right forward, and we are not worried about this situation. If he moves sideways, we can take the square that he's given up, and because our king, picture this as like a hallway. We know it's called a file in chess. Chess lingo is ranks and files, right? The first rank, second rank, and we have H and G and F files, etc. As soon as we've sidestepped, we are preparing to walk alongside our pawn, one step at a time, and help that pawn reach its goal square and queen. So the enemy will typically come right back in front of the pawn. We will take the opposition, and we will continue to repeat this process, taking opposition and moving to the side file, preparing to protect our pawn up the hallway. The king moves back and forth. This is his best possible defense. Eventually, we reach our goal square, and if we've done our work and we really know that that position is winning, we know that we get this, and the game is winning for us, regardless of whose move it is. Now, some of you during this process were thinking, well, what if the king doesn't just move back? What if he comes forward, trying to hold the opposition? Well, in this case, as long as you maintain to a simple rule, which is the pawn must stay behind the pawn or at the very worst equal to the king. The pawn must stay behind the king or equal to the king. This particular position is an exception where the pawn can actually push equal to the king, as long as within the next couple moves you still try to bring the king forward first. We will show what happens when you break this rule. But even if you didn't, even if you just maintain my rule the way I like to teach it, is remember your goal, king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th. Opposition is your tool. That's the second rule. And rule number 3 is keep the pawn behind the king. If you maintain to this rule and just continue to move forward, he will never have a way to maintain direct opposition. Eventually, his best chance is to come back in front. Now, would you push this pawn or move forward with the king? Think about it for a second. Okay, you can pause your video if you wish. Obviously, the answer is to take with the king. Now, many players misplay these endgames by reaching a position like this. This is what I've been alluding to for a while. If you reach a position where your enemy king, the enemy king is in front of your pawn, and your pawn is now equal to your king, the game is a forced draw. He simply takes opposition, and you have to lead with the pawn. At first, you may not realize that this is headed toward a forced draw. But if black understands one basic concept that applies to this position, or if we moved everything back a few rows, which we will in a second. If the pawn is ever in front of the king, the black king must apply to one simple rule, and that is move the king back, straight back from the pawn. He comes straight back, and now whenever the king moves forward, we have opposition meeting this king on either opposing square. He comes forward, we take opposition. He comes forward, we take opposition. He plays a little, shadabbery and tries to trick us. We're not getting tricked. We are always coming straight back from the pawn. Eventually, you will see that we're never going to break this. So he eventually gives up and knows that he must come forward and give us opposition, in which case the pawn pushes forward with check. And unlike the other position where we had this situation with black to play, it is white to play, and therefore the game is a forced stalemate. At first, that looks confusing. But if you watch this video a couple times, which again I suggest, you will see the difference. At first you see a position like this, which looks very similar to the one that was winning. The difference is that in the other position, it was white to move here. White was pushing forward, the king had to move, and we won. But in the position we reach now, the one where we broke that rule, it is black to play, and we have to push forward with check, which always reaches the forced drawn position. So the basic rule is that if you get the pawn in front of the king, we'll see it from all the way from the beginning so you understand that this is not just tomfoolery. This is real business. If you ever have a position where the pawn is in front of the king, the position is a forced draw. Black will simply repeat by coming straight back. You will have to make progress. He will take opposition. This process will repeat itself. As we see, as we already discussed, there are no tricks as long as he knows to come straight back from the pawn. And eventually we see this position being reached by force. He is always coming straight back. Eventually we reach this position here where he is prepared to take opposition. He does so, and the game is a forced draw. So don't break the rule of having the pawn in front of the king. If you've already broken that rule, given the fact that maybe you came from a position where you had no control over that, then unfortunately, despite your pawn advantage, the endgame is probably simply a forced draw. But if there is a choice in winning basic king and pawn endings, the king leads the way. And when you remember the goal of king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, always wins the game, it's easy to keep that in mind because when it's not pawn on the 6th, king on the 5th, it's king on the 6th. So that helps you keep your goal in mind. So here are my tools. Remember your goal. Opposition is your tool. You take opposition and take the square he's given up. Repeat this process. If he ever breaks it by coming up, as long as the pawn remains behind the king, you can still win. Here we are at that position again. Would we want to lead with the king or push the pawn with check, allowing him to go back in front? Obviously, we go here with the king. And now again, we can push the pawn. But here's another good question. It looks really similar to you, right? Am I going to push this pawn? Or am I going to put my king there? Did I ever fully reach my goal of king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th? Kind of looks like it. The king is on the 6th, pawn is on the 5th. But it wasn't the position we know is winning, with the king and pawn on the same file. If we push here, this is a draw, because the timing was not the same. But if you remember and trust that as long as you reach this position, you're winning regardless, you might as well go for it. I've said before, grandmasters are very lazy. If a position is known winning, a grandmaster will always choose that path, even if there's a fancier way to do it. So, remember your goal. Opposition is your tool to reach your goal. He cannot prevent you. He can only try to trick you. And if you remember the final rule, which is as long as the pawn remains behind the king and you lead toward your goal with the king, you will always reach a winning position. Notice that I switched the pawn, just to prove the point that this concept works with every single one of these pawns, except for the rook pawns, as we already pointed out. Okay, that is a basic description of how to win a king and pawn ending. Now, we are assuming you know how to checkmate once you get the queen. Now, assumptions are we know what, right? Assumptions are no bueno. So you will also see video explaining this, a very short video. But for players who haven't covered that concept yet, you will need to understand how to checkmate with a king and queen or a king and rook in order to fully grasp the purpose of this endgame. And even though that sounds like a basic point, well, obviously that's true, Danny, thanks, right? It's a very important point as you progress. You need to try to make sure, as you learn more complicated positions, that you understand where the position is headed. People have an illusion that grandmasters can calculate 30 moves ahead. Well, on occasion, maybe they can. But the majority of the time, we're calculating 4 or 5 moves ahead with a very good understanding of the next position that's coming because of experience and because of intuition and because of knowledge of these types of technical patterns. So, if you gave this position to Rivka or something, you might see it announcing like a forced mate in 30, which would include which would include coming up the board, getting a queen, and then checkmating. Would a grandmaster be calculating that 30 moves to know that it's winning? Of course not. He simply follows the pattern and the game evolves on itself. So that's a basic understanding of of a more deep concept. Have you ever looked at a position with a grandmaster where you felt they were almost being arrogant, saying, oh, well, this position is over because of A, B, C, and D, right? And you think that not only is the guy arrogant, he's just unwilling to really explain it, and he probably doesn't really see it all the way to the end. But in reality, he does, not because he just calculated 50 moves, but because of this idea, followed by this idea, followed by that winning king and pawn ending, followed by checkmating with the queen. Okay, you just know the position is evolving. So remember that concept. Very basically explained here. It also starts to apply to every advanced position. Now, we are not done with this endgame here, with this video here. That is the first basic concept you should know about every king and pawn ending in my book. The next really important concept I'd like you to be aware of is called the rule of the square. This is a perfect example of it. The idea is that when calculating a race position, you're pushing a pawn and he's trying to catch you. A lot of people who maybe haven't built up their calculation skills would struggle with something like that. Not sure who's catching who, and it would take them a few minutes. And perhaps in a real game against an equal opponent, do you always have a few minutes on the clock in an equal endgame? Maybe you don't. Maybe you're blitzing. So here is a concept that you can remember. And at first it's tricky. I will be honest, I personally struggled with this concept, and I was much more comfortable calculating I go there, he goes there for a long time. But eventually you learn the concept, and you start to apply it in your chess. The basic idea is that there is a box from the queening square to the diagonal queening square. If you see the clear box here, there are 4 squares involved. Okay? The simple rule is this. If the enemy king, example, let's say White's last move was here. If the enemy king is moving into the box, and then it's your turn, meaning he moves here and the box is created. He is catching your pawn without exception. This can be applied to even the most furthest pawn race. Okay? So, in this position, the king is actually currently within a box. However, in this position, the box doesn't apply. Who can tell me why with White to play? Think about it for a sec while Papa Bear takes a sip of coffee. The reason, you silly billies, is that the pawn can move 2 squares on the first move. So the king is not actually entering the box. That's a funny way to look at it. So if you calculate it, the king is 1 square short. However, if it were black to play in the given position, let's say the king was here. Now the position is a draw because he enters the box. And he will always be catching your pawn just in time. So envisioning this square control box is one way to eliminate some of the necessary calculation of a king and pawn ending. Okay, so again, here White would be winning with White to play because the king is simply not entering the box. He is short. However, if we were in a position where it was black to play and he's entering the box, now you know by visualizing it yourself that there is a box and he is catching your pawn. I say that kind of lightly, that any pattern you learn is going to eliminate king and pawn ending calculation. This is going to be a long series here, probably of at least 5 videos designed to hopefully take you from beginner understanding of king and pawn ending tricks and patterns to the point where you are solving practical positions that were played by grandmasters, and sometimes very difficult ones. It's not easy, but the goal is that you can apply some intuition and some calculation into your calculation. You can apply some intuition into your calculation. And again, I'm being tongue twisted because one of the major things I believe about king and pawn endings is if there's anything you can learn, it's you should fear king and pawn endings. They are very complicated, and unless you have a very clear memory of an intuitive pattern that you know you learned, then almost always you should rely on pure calculation. Because king and pawn endings are a lot of I go there, he goes there, I go there, he goes there, and you're trying to see it as far as you can, not quite sure. The more you learn patterns, the less you have to do this. But it's still something that you should be ready to do anytime you enter a king and pawn ending. Okay, this is sort of a short video, but the idea is that I want to get these 2 major concepts across. Please make sure before you move on to further king and pawn ending videos, as well as other pawn structure basics, that you understand these concepts. Thank you, and go have an awesome day.